Hello everyone. This video is going to be a review of the homework number 8. For the first 3 problems, I'm just going to work through the annotation for these derivations, and I'll try to keep my explanations to a minimum. The first 2 line numbers in the first problem are primary assumptions. Line 3 is an application of quantifier negation on line 2. Line 4 is an application of universal elimination on line 3, universal elimination. Line 5 is an application of the same rule, universal elimination on line 1. And then from 4 and 5 together, we get by modus tollens, line 6. And finally, line 7 is an application of universal introduction on line 6. Let's look at the next problem. Okay, so once again, our first 2 lines are primary assumptions. And our third line is some kind of an auxiliary assumption. We need to figure out what that is. Here I will pause, and let's see what happens. So when you look at line 3, it's actually an instance of the existential generalization on line 2. That relationship, which you can see, is a clue that we're looking at an application of existential elimination. Remember, whatever we annotate here has to be a subderivation rule. We only have a handful of subderivation rules. Existential elimination is the new one. We might even want to flag this. That name A cannot come out of this subderivation. If we look at line 8, which is the last line of the subderivation, and line 9, they're the same sentence. Moreover, they don't contain the name A. This is about as good evidence as you can get that this is an application of existential elimination. Line 4 is universal elimination on line 1. Universal elimination. And then line 5 actually comes from line 3, wedge introduction. And line 6 is De Morgan's on line 5. And then line 6 comes from 4 and 6. It's another application of modus tollens, isn't it? So we have the conditional on line 4 and the denial of its consequent on line 6, right? And the conclusion or the sentence inferred is the negation of the antecedent of the conditional. That's modus tollens. And then line 7 or line 8 is existential introduction on line 7. That's a 7. That's one of my 7s. Let me make it prettier for you. Line 7, existential introduction. So then we're ready for this application of existential elimination. Okay, so this line 9 is at the end of the subderivation. It takes the last line of the subderivation and copies it along the next outer scope line. That's exactly what existential elimination says that we get to do. Okay, but what do we annotate for the input? Importantly, we take the subderivation 3 through 8. And it's sometimes easy to forget, but this is also important. We take the existential generalization, which is up there on line 2. And again, the instance of the generalization is our auxiliary assumption. So there's the generalization, and then there's the subderivation that begins with its instance. And then we're exporting the last line of the subderivation that does not contain the name we use to form that instance. Line 10 then is an application of quantifier negation on line 9. Okay, so let's go up now. We've got to work on line 3. Problem number 3. So one primary assumption. We have an auxiliary assumption here, and we need to know what's going on. Let's wait. We don't have to fill it out right now. Line 3 is the result of conjunction elimination on line 2. And then line 4 is another auxiliary assumption. Here I will draw our attention to, once again, we have an existential generalization on line 3 and one of its instances on line 4. Okay, so that's a clue. We might be looking at another application of existential elimination. If we want to look at the bottom of the subderivation, we have this sentence. There's an x, px, and qx. And notice that after the subderivation ends, that very sentence is moved to the next outer scope line. Again, it's pretty solid evidence. We're looking at an application of existential elimination. I know it's complicated, but those are the important pieces. Line 5 comes from line 1 by universal elimination. And then 4 and 5 together give us line 6 by conditional elimination. What we see on line 7 is just the addition, conjunction introduction on 4 and 6. 4 and 6 ampersand I. And then line 8 is existential introduction on line 7. So now we need to annotate this application of existential elimination. The subderivation stop, move to the next outer scope line. And so we've got the existential on line 3, and then the subderivation that runs 4 through 8. That's existential elimination. Here's another auxiliary assumption. It's the head of a subderivation, so we're going to come back to it later. And if we look at line 11, it's an instance of the generalization on line 10. So I'm thinking existential elimination, but let's investigate. If we look a little lower down, we see that the last line of this subderivation, line 16, is copied on line 17 along the next outer scope line. We also see that this sentence that's exported basically does not contain the name we use to form the instance. So if we want to, this is, by the way, optional. You didn't have to do this on the homework problem. We can flag that. And by the way, we can do the same thing up here for this existential elimination. Lines 12 and 13 come from line 11 by ampersand E. Right? And then lines 14 and 15 are the existential introduction on 12 and 13. And then line 16 is just adding 14 and 15 together by conjunction introduction. Right? And now here we are at line 17, ready to apply existential elimination. There's an existential generalization on line 10. Subderivation starting on line 11 is an instance of that generalization. The subderivation runs through line 16. That's existential elimination. So now we're going to look down here. We see that the output, the target sentence, is after a subderivation. And we also see that it's a biconditional. So is there a rule that gives us biconditionals from subderivations? The answer is yes. It's called biconditional introduction. You can go back and take a look at that. So this is actually what we've been applying with these subderivations we haven't finished annotating. So we look at this target sentence. There's an X and there's a P and there's a Q if and only if there's something that's P and Q. Okay, so this is a biconditional, and we see we can now kind of see the subderivation. This first subderivation moves from the left side of the biconditional to the right side, and then the second subderivation moves from the right side of the biconditional to the left side. Okay, so this is definitely two subderivations for biconditional introduction. Triple bar I and triple bar I. So how do we annotate that? By citing the ranges of the two subderivations, 2 through 9 and 10 through 17. Squeeze that in there. Okay, so those are the answers to the complete the annotation problems. And we have then the last two problems where you are asked to find the mistakes in rule applications or annotations. And again, I'm going to move kind of quickly here, but I want to make sure that, especially with the quantifier rules, we see what's happening. Okay, so let's look at line 3. It says that this is an assumption for existential introduction. Existential introduction is not a subderivation rule. You should never see a rule stated after your auxiliary assumption that isn't a subderivation rule. However, existential elimination is a subderivation rule. And if we look at this, we see that RBA and not KB is a substitution instance of the existential generalization on line 1. Okay, so you don't have to do this for the homework, any homework ever, but I'm going to flag that B is supposed to be isolated to this subderivation. Okay, and then the same thing happens here. This is existential elimination. You look at the existential generalization on line 2. Look at the expression here. Line 4 is an instance of line 2, okay? And the instance was formed by introducing the name C, which is new to the proof. We're going to try to keep that isolated to the subderivation. I got a couple of applications of conjunction elimination. That's no problem. However, on line 7, we have an application of conjunction introduction. Conjunction introduction takes 2 line numbers as input. This is actually from lines 5 and 6, conjunction introduction. Line 8 makes a mistake. There's a big mistake here. So line C, whether you're using the super proviso or the book's 3 individual provisos, line C is not allowed out of this proof by existential elimination. So this application of existential elimination on line 8 has violated one of the provisos, and it certainly violated the super proviso. There's another problem in line 9. So we see that line 8 has 2 different names, C and B. Problem is that those names have both been replaced by the same variable in applying existential introduction. That's definitely not okay. So we've got rule violations or annotation errors on lines 3, 4, 7, 8, and 9 in this proof, and all of the other line numbers are fine. Let's look at problem number 5. This is the last problem. So far, so good. We have line 3 is an instance of the existential on line 2. It's an assumption for existential elimination. That's great. Conjunction elimination, that's pretty straightforward. Universal elimination from line 1, yep, that works. Line 6 is not modus tollens, actually. It is conditional elimination. Modus tollens' brother. So line 6 had an error. Let's look at line 7. We have SAA, and then a universal introduction on one of those A's. So this is seriously problematic. There's a couple of problems here. A is actually a name that is in a live assumption, so we can't do universal introduction on it. Also, when we do universal introduction, we have to replace all occurrences of the name in the sentence with the variable for of the universal quantifier we're going to introduce. But here's a residual A. That's not allowed. So this violates both provisos on universal introduction. But even if we set that aside, line 8 replaces A, this time A with an X. And there's nothing really wrong about that. There are no A's left in the result of the rule application, but once again, A is up here in the assumptions, not allowed. So there's a violation of one of the provisos on universal introduction. That's going to infect in some way everything that comes after, but controlling for that, there's no rule application violation on line 9. So the only mistakes in problem number 5 are 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so that is our homework number 8. And I hope it was helpful, but if you have any questions, just make sure that you reach out and ask them.